Hello, welcome to the paper Introduction to Philosophy. We have been discussing about the social contract, the theory of justice and the scientific rigor, and we continue to discuss this theme further. This is Professor Ananya Barua in the Department of Philosophy, Hindu College, and this paper, Introduction to Philosophy, is introduced to the Semester 1 students of University of Delhi, UGCF, NEP syllabus. Now, when we talk about the role of epistemic justice in education, let us understand the first thing first. Firstly, the correcting the testimonial injustice. Teachers must critically examine biases. Classroom participation must be inclusive. Example, encouraging marginalized students to speak, taking their contributions seriously, and that which builds in epistemic confidence. Number 2, addressing hermeneutical gaps. Expand interpretive frameworks in curriculum. Introduce concepts that help students articulate lived realities. For example, gender studies enabling articulation of discrimination, social theory explaining structural inequality. Education becomes a space of self-understanding. Number 3, cultivating epistemic virtues. Drawing from epistemology, including Duncan Pritchard-like virtues frameworks, which is to do with intellectual humility, open-mindedness, critical reflection. These are essential for scientific temper, democratic reasoning. Number 4, enabling dialogical pedagogy. This is necessary so that we shift from monologue to dialogue. Knowledge emerges through interaction. Classroom becomes a mini public sphere, a site of shared reasoning. Number 5, democratizing knowledge. Epistemic justice aligns with accessibility, which is to do with open resources, inclusivity, diverse voices, participation, that is student engagement. Knowledge, thus, is no longer owned by elites but correlated socially. Now, let us see some of the challenges and tensions that comes up in such epistemological pedagogy in today's time. Number 1, relativism versus standards. Thus, recognizing multiple knowledges undermine truth. The resolution is maintain standards of evidence and reasoning, but expand who participates in knowledge production. Number 2, authority versus equality. Teachers possesses expertise. And what is the way out? The way out is a balanced approach where authority acts as guidance, not domination. Encourage questioning without collapsing rigor. Number 3, structural constraints, which are, of course, exam systems, institutional hierarchies, language barriers. Epistemic justice thus requires systemic reform, not just individual goodwill. Now, what could be the broader implications of this epistemic justice? So, what can be done is we can link it to social justice. When we talk about epistemic injustice, it reinforces economic inequality, political exclusion. Education becomes a site of justice, not just instruction. Number 2, link to scientific temper. Scientific temper requires free inquiry, critical reasoning, and without epistemic justice, only a few can question and others remain passive. What could be the broader implications? Democratic citizenship, where democracy depends on informed, reasoning citizens. equal participation in discourse. Thus, epistemic justice is foundational to deliberative democracy. So, where do we head from the role of epistemic justice then? The role of epistemic justice in education is transformative. It redefines who counts as a knower. It reshapes what counts as knowledge. It redistributes who gets to speak and be heard. Thus, education becomes just not when it merely distributes knowledge, but when it restores the right to know, to question, and to be understood. So, the following question is, what is at stake? Scientific temper, as articulated by Nehru and philosophically developed by Chattopadhyay, involves rational inquiry, critical skepticism, openness to evidence, freedom from dogma. The challenge, however, is, can traditions often be seen as spiritual or metaphysical contribute to these rational ethos? Number 2, breaking the false binary, tradition versus reason. A superficial view assumes tradition is something which is to do with faith, authority, dogma. Science, on the other hand, is to do with reason, critique, evidence. So, the philosophical correction is Indian philosophical traditions are not monolithic. They include rigorous logic, Nyaya, empiricism, Buddhist Pramana theory, skepticism, Charvaka, dialectics, Madhyamika. Therefore, Indian thought already contains internal resources of rationality. What are the epistemological contributions then? The plural theories of knowledge, which is called as Pramanavada, in Indian systems asks, how do we know? They identify multiple pramanas or means of knowledge. Number 1, perception, pratyaksha. Number 2, inference, anumana. Number 3, testimony, shabda. So, modern scientific temper often privileges empiricism plus experimentation. Indian traditions adds nuanced analysis of testimony and interpretation. Recognition of contextual knowledge is when it enriches scientific temper by making it more self-reflective about its epistemic limits. Now, in Nyaya, logic and critical reasoning, the Nyaya school develops formal logic where there is a structure of debating the Vada, criteria for valid knowledge, and the contribution is that it encourages argumentation and critical scrutiny. However, the problem is it rejects the blind acceptance of authority, and this problematic part ought to be rigorously celebrated, because only then we understand that the Nyaya aligns strongly with scientific temper, rationality as disciplined reasoning. Just like the scientific temper of Nyaya, we also have the scientific rigorousness seen in Buddhist epistemology, experience and reflexivity. Thinkers like Dignaga, Dharmakirti emphasizes direct experience, pratyaksha, logical inference and critical examination of cognition itself. Thus, the contribution that we see is in Buddhist epistemology, it introduces reflective awareness, which is how do our perceptions get constructed. This anticipates modern concerns about biasness, cognitive error. Now, going beyond the Nyaya's scientific temperament, the Buddhist's epistemology of scientific rigor, let us pick up the Charvaka's scientific temper, if any. Now, Charvak is categorically called as radical skepticism, for it rejects inference beyond perception. It critiques religious authority. The contribution of Charvak is that it encourages skepticism towards metaphysical claims. It challenges dogma, and it is definitely a vital ingredient of scientific temper. Its method, at most we can say, is doubt as a method, for it doubts everything, including the presence of God. The ethical and the existential enrichment, however, when we try to discuss, we see that the scientific temper is often seen as value neutral. But Indian traditions introduce ethical depth. Knowledge and ethics, in many Indian systems, knowledge, which is jnana, is linked with liberation, that is moksha. The ethical transformation, if we try to look at it, we see that knowledge is not just instrumental, control, prediction, but also transformative, self-understanding. Scientific temper becomes not just knowing the world, but also knowing oneself. Intellectual humility, traditions like Advaita Vedanta emphasizes limits of conceptual knowledge, openness to revision. Thus, it counters scientific arrogance and encourages epistemic humility. What is the dialogical culture then? Indian philosophy through the dialogical culture is all about debating. The public reasoning aligns with democratic discourse, scientific inquiry as collective process. If we also look at D.P. Chattopadhyay's works, we see that it is a synthesis where he was insistent that scientific temper is not alien to India. It has been rooted in historical experience, cultural traditions. So, rationality is not just abstract, it is historically situated. Therefore, Indian traditions can ground scientific temper socially and culturally. However, there needs to be a critical caution. Avoid romanticization. To say Indian traditions enrich scientific temper is not to say all traditions are rational. All beliefs are scientifically valid. Problems with tradition could definitely be because for superstition, hierarchical authority, which is to do with caste, patriarchy. Resistance to critique, therefore, traditions must be engaged critically, not reverentially. So, when we are discussing towards a synthesis, we must understand that we need to expand scientific temper from narrow empiricism to plural reflective rationality. Integrating reason and context in Western science, it is usually the universal method. In Indian traditions, it is contextual reasoning. Together, a more holistic epistemology comes up, and thus it brings us to what we call as democratizing rationality, which is using indigenous traditions to make scientific temper culturally resonant. Some of the broader philosophical questions that comes up are various. For example, can Indian philosophical traditions enrich scientific temper? Yes, it can, but in a critical, dialogical way. Indian philosophical traditions contribute to epistemic pluralism, logical rigor, reflexive awareness, and ethical depth. Scientific temper becomes richer when it is not uprooted from culture, but when culture itself is transformed into a space of critical reason. If we go ahead and look at the PPT here, we see that the comparison of Indian traditions and Western philosophy vis-a-vis the scientific temper. The aim of knowledge in Indian tradition has largely been about liberation, moksha, and for Western it has been explanation, prediction, control. Relation to ethics in Indian tradition has been integrated, whereas in Western philosophy it has been often separated. Scientific temper emerges differently. In the West, it is a methodological rigor. In India, as philosophical, ethical rationality. Now, the nature of reason. Indian tradition is completely contextual and pluralistic. Western philosophy has been largely universal and formal. Epistemology, Indian traditions has been multiple pramanas. Western philosophy emphasizes on empiricism and rationalism. The methodology in Indian tradition has been dialogical and dialectical. Western philosophy has been analytical and experimental. So, when we talk about epistemology again, as much as we had seen from the Indian side, we see that from the Western tradition, starting with Francis Bacon, who talks about empiricism, induction, there is also René Descartes, who talks about rationalism, doubt. There is David Hume, where skepticism about causation is noted. Knowledge grounded in observation, experimentation, and logical reasoning are argued. Similarly, in the Indian traditions, Nyaya, it is all about inference and logic. In Buddhist epistemology, it is all about perception and inference. In Mimamsha, testimony or shabda is all about valid knowledge. Thus, knowledge includes empirical, logical, linguistic, and social. Western thought narrows focuses to empirical verification. Indian thought broadens it to epistemic pluralism. Thus, scientific temper becomes more self-aware about limits of perception, role of language, and testimony. There is also this ism called skepticism and doubt, and it is interesting to see how this form of epistemology has been picked up from the Western lens and the Indian lens. In the Western line, it is all about the Cartesian's methodic doubt, Hume's radical skepticism. Doubt is methodological, a tool to secure certainty. In the Indian line, it is Charvak that rejects metaphysics. Buddhists' Madhyamaka critiques all fixed views. Thus, doubt is ontological and existential, a way to expose conceptual illusions. The comparative insight thus is in Western skepticism. It seeks certainty after doubt. In Indian skepticism, it embraces openness and non-finality. Scientific temper thus becomes less dogmatic and more open-ended. Now, when we talk about logic and argumentation, we see that in the Western logic, it is to do with formal, symbolic logic, Aristotle onwards, which is also based on precision and abstraction. Indian logic, Nyaya, there are the 5-step inference or syllogism embedded in debate, Vada tradition. The comparative insight is Western logic is to do with formal clarity, Indian logic is to do with dialogical engagement. Now, scientific temper becomes not just about correct reasoning, but also about reasoning in dialogue. Also, when we talk about science and experience, in the Western science, it deals largely with objectivity, external observation, separation of subject and object. In the Indian thought, it emphasizes on inner experience, especially in Buddhist and Vedantic traditions. Reflexivity, examining the knower. Thus, if we compare, we see that in the West, knowledge is of the world. In India, knowledge is of the world plus the self. Thus, scientific temper includes awareness of cognitive biasness, reflexive critique of the observer. Now, when it comes to knowledge and ethics, in Western modernity, science is often treated as value neutral. Ethics is applied externally. In Indian traditions, knowledge is tied to liberation and ethical transformation. The comparative insight is that in Western tradition, there has always been a separation of fact and value. In Indian, there has been an integration of knowledge and ethics. The enrichment is this, that the scientific temper becomes ethically responsible, sensitive to consequences. When we go ahead about universality versus contextuality, in the Western approach, it is to do with universal laws, objective truths, independent of context. In the Indian approach, it is largely to do with context-sensitive reasoning. It emphasizes on situated knowledge, comparative insight, and in Western, it is focused majorly on universalism. In Indian, it is focused majorly in contextualism. Thus, the scientific temper balances universal validity with local relevance. Towards Chattopadhyay's mediating vision in scientific temperament between the East and the West, or the Oriental and the Occidental, when we talk about the scientific rigor, we see that Chattopadhyay provides a bridge. So he says scientific temperament must be rational, historically grounded, and also culturally embodied or culturally embedded. Some of the key contributions that he has come up with is this: he resisted blind imitation of Western science. There has been romantic glorification of tradition. Instead, he advocates a critical synthesis. The philosophical synthesis that D.P. Chattopadhyay talks about has been a richer scientific temperament that emerges when from Western philosophy there is empirical rigor, logical precision, experimental method. From Indian traditions, it is to do with epistemic pluralism, reflexivity, and ethical integration, followed by dialogical reasoning. Thus, we see that Western philosophy teaches us how to know with precision. Indian philosophy teaches us how to know with awareness. Together, they transform scientific temper into a holistic practice of reason. The concluding reflection thus about the Eastern and the Western scientific temperament is this: the democratization and enrichment of scientific temper in societies like India depends on this synthesis, which is not rejecting Western science, not uncritically glorifying tradition, but creating a dialogue of rationalities. A truly global scientific temperament must be empirical yet reflective, universal yet contextual, critical yet ethical. Now, if someone questions that can Indian philosophical traditions enrich scientific temper, by now we should be in a position to state that Indian and Western traditions differ fundamentally in their approach to reason. However, Western philosophy, shaped by thinkers like Bacon and Descartes, emphasizes the method which is to do with empirical observation, experimentation, and logical precision. In contrast, Indian traditions as interpreted by Chattopadhyay stresses on contextual and plural rationality, integrating perception, inference and testimony while remaining sensitive to cultural and historical conditions. Thank you so much. See you in the next class.